Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the service in the morning. And we now have the microphone again, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get the microphone to you.
I know the drill. I'm thinking that the scripture and your great sermon this morning applied to a different type of a church service. I think they met more informally and didn't have all the chairs pointed in one direction, and it was a totally different scenario. So
Sure.
I'm thinking, maybe we ought to get more of that back somehow. I know we have the question and answer, which in most churches would be verboten, but
Right.
So I'm just thinking,
Yeah. Yeah. What did their service actually look like? Of course, it was orderly, and obviously, you have to have order in any kind of a service. A friend of mine once said, under organization is chaos. Over organization is stifling. And how did that actually look? We do know that a lot of what we do came out of the Reformation. The services were done in Latin, which no one could understand. They just kind of sat there and nodded their heads. The priest would occasionally speak, but that was off to the side. And one of the things the Reformers did, of course, was they wanted to bring the pulpit to the center, because their idea was that the Word of God was supposed to be front and center, if you will. They're supposed to be able to listen to this. So a lot of what we do comes from that, shall we say, tradition. One of the reasons why I think this would be I almost think that Paul might be ahead of himself here, or ahead of us, if you will. Because it'd be very hard, I think, to take a normal Sunday service and, shall we say, these prophets speak, and would we be willing to say, okay, I said something, now someone else said something and said I'm wrong. Would we even be, shall we say, mature enough to handle that type of interaction? I think it'd be very, very difficult to do that. Well, might not be much left by the time you're done practicing. If you want a biblical model, if you will, to say that you're supposed to open with a word of prayer, sing 3 hymns. I'll start with announcements. Sing 3 hymns. You definitely won't find that, at least I haven't found it yet, in the Bible. So why do we do what we do? One of the things that I did not spend a lot of time on this morning, because I just didn't have time for it this morning. In this passage, Paul uses a word a lot in this passage. It's the word let. He doesn't use that word too many other times in his epistle. He uses it a lot right in this passage. I didn't spend too much time on it. I'll address it next week because the word shows up again in the next week's passage. He does use that word a lot earlier on in 1 Corinthians 7 and 8 when he's talking about marrying and let these things go on. So I believe what he's saying is you don't have to have it this way in order to have a legit service. But you can allow for this type of a thing. We do know that he apparently utilized the synagogue model, especially in Acts. And the synagogue model certainly appears to be a person doing the teaching, other people listening. And we know that because Paul would come and sometimes they would say, they knew about him, they say, we'll let you speak. And he would speak. So that part of it looks a little bit more like our services today than perhaps what Paul is talking about here. So we do have some legitimacy for the way we do it, but we don't have a command, preach for 45 minutes, and that's the way it has to happen. I do believe that other cultures, the services will look perhaps a little bit different. The thing is that struck me about what Paul's saying here is he's doing something a little bit different. He's saying we still have authority, but that authority does not have to be centralized. And that's what we want to do. We want to make it easy for ourselves as pastors, have authority sort of centralized, and I'm the only one who can talk, and everybody else just sort of has to listen. And that is, I think Paul's getting away from that. Again, we in fact we were having this discussion last night about this very thing. Paul's unity is to have everybody study more. Our unity is to have everybody sort of study less. Paul's idea is that whoever is doing the teaching, if you will, has to be not beyond questioning. It can be questioned, but has done so much that the answers that person gives are worth listening to, other than, I'm the dad, just listen to me, or I'm the pastor, you're not, just listen to me. The word let, I think, is an important word in this passage. And if you get a chance to study it this week, look up that word in that passage and then compare it to what he says in 1 Corinthians 7, or chapter 7. And those are the two sections of the epistle in which he uses that word an awful lot. Yes?
Pastor, the verses 27 and 28 in 1 Corinthians 14, if anyone is speaking an unknown tongue, and it says, and let one interpret, and if there be no interpreter, etc. Well, there's a dilemma there if there's no interpreter. But I've observed in different situations where they're one and the same. Somebody
Oh, wait a minute. The interpreter and the speaker are the same?
The speaker speaks and then self-interprets.
Has anybody else ever seen that? Yeah, have you seen that? Some of you have? Okay, that one, that's new for me. Like I say, I'm not a... Okay, wow, okay.
Okay, so my point being is that, that's how they resolve this conflict, this dilemma
Okay.
in this passage. Because there is an interpreter, it's me. And I'm going to speak first and then interpret.
Okay. Yeah, again, I think I can solve that. We can save a lot of time here. Yeah.
I have heard this passage, like that God is not the author of confusion. I have heard it used to justify a shutting down of outside exhortation and rebuke to churches. For instance, I'll give you a tale of two churches. One church had abolitionists come to exhort them, and they invited them inside to speak from the pulpit, and the church then reviewed it as a whole. Another church had abolitionists come to exhort them from outside. They rebuked the abolitionists and publicly called them apostate and so on
Sure.
and so forth. And some of the justification was, God is not the author of confusion, and when you come to rebuke us from the outside, you're confusing our people because they're hearing teaching from somebody other than the pastor. So how do you address that application of this passage?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. Because I've thought about this. What if we had protesters outside our church? Knowing this type of church, I'd be like, the people in here, I think they wouldn't be chased away. They'd be like, I hope those protesters are there next week. I'm serious. If there were protesters of any stripe outside our church, I would hope that pretty much everybody in this room would be able to engage them. I would hope that. If they're not able to do that, then there's perhaps a little bit of failure going on my end. Now maybe there's new people. But I would know that if you can't engage protesters that are outside our church coming to talk to us, right? They're coming for the reason to talk to us. If we can't talk to them, then I'll know for sure that we're not out there talking to anybody else. No way. And with all our talk about witnessing and spreading the gospel and all that kind of stuff, if we couldn't talk to a bunch of protesters, we're not spreading anything, quite frankly. So, to answer the question, I would hope that if that ever happened here, we'd be able to engage them. The idea, I mean, if there is a passage in Scripture that says you have to only listen to the pastor, the one we just read is definitely not it. Definitely not, that's the wrong passage to go to. And I would say this even a little bit further, Liz, and that is that if we, how do I say this? If there are churches out there that just want to chase off protesters for just being protesters, then I would have to argue they've got themselves quite a little bubble going on. And they're not affecting their culture at all. They're not.
I just debate it as far as this passage being applied that way. What I'm asking you to speak to is the idea, because you were talking about it in the services, so this is why it came up. The idea that should a pastor be the only authority who is speaking to a church, or should he accept rebuke from outside? Like, is it biblically acceptable for someone to rebuke from the outside?
Paul is very clear on this. He's not saying you never ever challenge an elder. He said in the verse we read this morning, it's got to be 2 or 3 witnesses. What do? We say, well, it can never be done because he's a pastor. And you've probably all heard that, touch not the Lord's anointed. We've heard that one, right? Are you kidding me? 5 years ago, I was a concrete salesman. Go ahead, Jim. Okay. All right. You know, and obviously we honor the position. We do. And there's certain things that go with the position. But Paul never says you never challenge the person who holds it. He says this is how you do it. And he's talking about when he... See, this is why I say it's so opposite, so difficult for us, this passage. Because he's talking about peace in the church, and he's talking about order, and then he's talking about different people speaking. And our idea of order is opposite of that. Our idea of order is nobody speaks, except maybe one person. It's a challenging passage in our modern setting. Yes?
Couple thoughts. One is, I have seen you or heard you be fairly jealous of who gets behind that pulpit. So I can't imagine that people we don't know or you don't know would come out and protest and you would invite them into your pulpit.
And I wouldn't do that.
I mean, you would engage them and find out first.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I wondered about from the passage is...
We might arrange a pulpit swap, me first. I go first, and then you... Yeah. But you were saying.
When I have heard tongues spoken and interpretation, it's been a very spontaneous thing in the service. Is Paul calling away from the spontaneity if you have to know that there's an interpreter there? Do you have to find that out first and know that this is a plan? And that's confusing to me.
Yeah, I honestly, I never really even concluded that before I studied this passage this week, that Paul's actually starting with the interpreter. What is confusing to us is we have, shall we say, a spiritual gift of prophesying out of this just came on me, and this is what's going to happen in the future, and then we have what I am calling is shall we say, miraculous prophesying. You know, where people read the Bible and this is what it says, and this is how we comfort and encourage each other. And I believe Paul is saying there, why do we read a book? We read a book to learn things and to be encouraged to do the right things. And in a sense, I think Paul's saying is, you guys all be books for each other here. Everybody has different experiences. They know different things. They had read different passages of the Bible that week or whatever. And I think that's what he's really saying here. And he's talking about the non-miraculous part of prophesying here. Now, I don't think I got to your question.
Well, I'm just thinking about it. It's certainly not going to be spontaneous if you know there's an interpreter.
Right. Again, I need to say I'm kind of young with this, and I haven't resolved it completely, as I said in my sermon. But it sure looks like Paul is starting with like we have this person here that wants to say something. They speak this language. Do we have somebody that knows this language before this person starts talking? That is really different. My guess is you've never probably ever, in this passage, ever heard this said preached like that before. Yeah.
Concerning verse 31, for you can all prophecy one by one so that all may learn and all be encouraged. Pastor, the way you've presented that and explained that certainly seems to open that up to the potential of abuse. And I understand
Sure.
that there can never be a complete removal of the risk.
Sure.
But when you have a known, a likely potential of abuse of that passage, of that method, of that order in the service, or there's been a history of abusing that privilege, if I may use the term, is there any responsibility on the leadership, or is the responsibility on the people of the church sitting and judging to guard against that abuse? And I suppose along the same vein, more generally, is there a responsibility, and whose responsibility would it be to protect the doctrine formally and informally taught within this church from behind that pulpit?
Yeah, Sid, I'm afraid you've got sort of the core of the issue here. I think that this would be a whole lot easier to deal with if these statements would have been made to the church at Berea. But we've got to remember who he's talking to here. I mean, he's said again, your children, I can't talk to you. You're all split up. You're a mess. And oh, by the way, you can all prophesy. Corinthians, let's do a little manuscript study here. We have a little manuscript mix-up. Of course, we don't. I can't resolve that completely except to say that it looked like this bar was extremely high. Perhaps even higher than what it is in our churches today, meaning the entire congregation is sitting there evaluating what you say to see if it's scriptural or not. And then you had other prophets doing the exact same thing, and if they spoke up and said that what you said was wrong, you had to keep silent. So it seems like there's a really high bar here of really thinking through really hard about what you had to say before you said it. And that appears to be Paul's answer to your question, appears to be, how do you protect from abuse? You see, we have a couple, there's different ways to abuse. I mean, if you had a pastor that everybody listens to all the time, then he could be abusing everybody and nobody even knows it. I mean, you can't tell. It's just a pastor. I gave you that example of a pastor. This happened, I might have mentioned this before, he was talking about that God doesn't condemn. And he's going to John 3:16 that said that God doesn't condemn anyone. Jesus didn't come to condemn. No condemnation. And he's going from John 3:16. And I know what verse in the Bible he's using. And I know what John 3:17 says. And 18. Jesus didn't come to condemn because they were already condemned. The entire world was like pre-condemned. Didn't have to condemn. They're already condemned. And didn't he switch to a different version to say that God didn't come to judge the world? So he got out of it. It's like, it was sleight of hand there. And so that's abuse going on, but nobody's questioning it. And it seems to me like Paul was saying, and again, this is tough stuff, not what I'm used to. Paul is saying, we're gonna guard from abuse the other way. We're gonna let people speak, but they're going to be judged by every single person. I haven't gotten to the end of this one yet. Like I say, this was some you know how it is. Some passages you say, I think I get this, and other passages it's a war. This week it was war, but not as much as next week.
Just in reference to the word let, did I understand you correctly to be saying that that word means that the commands are optional, or there's this is one way you can do it? Is that what you were saying?
That is what I was saying. In other words, I believe he's saying you can allow this. And for context, I went back to 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is making allowances for certain types of marriage, shall we say, situations.
So, I mean, it also says, let all things be done unto edifying.
Right, yeah.
So, is that optional then?
Yeah. When I studied this, I had a challenge because there's different words. Some words that are translated let, and I wasn't able to do a real thorough study on this. Some do mean to allow, and some are sometimes it means it's a word of affirmation or even command. And certainly in this context, let all things be done. We know what Paul's saying there because of the rest of the context. He's attacking their confusion, and so we know he's saying, kind of like if someone said, like our hymn, "Let all things now living." In other words, it's a statement of joining in and of understanding something and applying it as a result of what we already know. So he's definitely not saying, "Oh yeah, well let all things be done easily," because that's allowable. He's definitely not saying that there. But if you go back to the 1 Corinthians 7 passage where he begins to use that word, I think we can distinguish between what he's saying by command and what he's saying by allowance, because we know that he certainly uses that kind of terminology in 1 Corinthians 7. He'll say something like, well, I don't have this command from the Lord, for example. So we know that he talks that way. And he's saying there are some things that are allowable and there are some things that are commanded. And we can't, we're not used to that type of talk. And he did that in Romans also. We're not used to Paul saying something like, well, I don't have a command from the Lord on this. Well, what are you talking for? Then why is it in the Bible? And it really drives us to study harder to try to figure this stuff out. I'll tell you something. If the Bible was not inspired, if it really was the word of man, there's some stuff I'd have out in a big hurry. It's just too hard. I mean, it's hard to figure out. This is one of them, I believe. Yes.
I'd like to make a comment a little bit. I never recognized it before that there has to be an interpreter there. And I think that person, like you mentioned, I think he had a special gift. I think he knew ahead of time that he was an interpreter, that he could make that have to be there. And another thing too that today is we talked about it. I think that we see that people that had these gifts today, because when I was in Bible college, I went out to different churches because I was invited to go over their tongue doctors. And the women was doing a lot of it. I mean, and the Bible definitely says women's not to do it. So we can say right off the bat that that's of the devil, because it's contrary to the word of God. And that these gifts were given, like the tongues of prophecy and all the other gifts, were given to the unity of the body, coming to unity, realizing that Jews and Gentiles were one in the faith.
Yes.
And after that, they were to cease. I believe today they have totally ceased. And sometimes, like when I was in Bible college, they would say, well, we're prophesying. No, we're not prophesying. We were just repeating what's already been said and written. We're not prophesying. When somebody gets up and says, he's prophesied, he's also identifying himself with a tongue talking group and the healers and all that, which is very dangerous today to associate. And it divides the church. It divides, these people think they have something that the rest of us don't have. Like we don't quite measure up to them. They got something special. And so they separate themselves from us. And that's a dangerous thing too. It separates believers from one another.
Yeah. That was this hierarchy, the stratifying of the church, which is introduced again by this kind of thing. I have this gift and you don't. Was exactly what Paul was at war against. That's exactly what he was fighting against throughout the entire epistle. And sure enough, then we want to introduce it again. We want to go back to it, which is way wrong. It can't be. To stratify the church is to, I think, throw out the entire book of 1 Corinthians. Why are we even studying it? We can't have it. Well, I want to thank you for all your kind attention here this morning. We'll dismiss here in a moment. We have another hymn.